Good morning and welcome to today's webinar. Today we're going to be talking about how to make your continuous testing efforts profitable and create a return of value for your organization. My name is Matt Clausen. I'm VP of Marketing at Parasoft, and I'll be your host and presenter today. So just thanks for joining and welcome. So a couple housekeeping items before we get started. First of all, we, of course, are recording this presentation as via Bright Talk. So not only can you watch this live version, but a recorded version of this will be made available. In addition, there are some downloads that you can check out, including a PDF of this presentation. And so I welcome you or invite you to go ahead and check those out, download some items. There's also going to be some calls to action of things that you can follow up with as well at the very end. And then finally, we will have live Q&A. So as I present, you can feel free to type in your questions at any time. And then at the very end, we will handle Q&A. And I'll field the questions that we have. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation and let's get started. All right, so develop a profitable continuous testing strategy to minimize risk, reduce defects, and ensure compliance. That is our presentation today. We will, in terms of the agenda, I'm going to start by looking at a dilemma that you have, I imagine many companies have, which I call the continuous dilemma. And we're going to start there to kind of set the stage for then why you want to define a continuous testing strategy. Why is it important? Super important that we do that. And then we're going to look at in more detail, right, delivering a return for your investment. So why is it you want to do it? How do you get it done? And then what value is it going to provide, or how would you calculate that value? So before we begin, I'm going to ask you a simple question. Is quality your top priority? So this Dilbert, which came out, I think, in 2004-ish, is pretty funny. This is just the first part of that comic, which says, remember, quality is our top priority. Now, if you know anything about Dilbert, right, it probably isn't their top priority. And you'll find out why, like many companies, some other things get in the way of quality being the top priority. But here's the thing. There is a price to be paid. In fact, there's a report that came out, the cost of poor software quality in just the US alone for 2020 came out in 2021, early 2021, this report, and it shows that the cost of poor software quality is something like over $2 trillion to just the US economy alone, which is a huge number. So the point is, when quality and other things get in the way of quality being your top priority, right, there's a cost. So this is why you should pay attention to the presentation. And we're going to talk about how do we minimize that and improve the value. So let's talk about the continuous dilemma. So one of the things that I think everybody would agree with is that software is really at the heart of digital transformation. It has been for well over a decade. You could argue it's been so for 2 to 3 decades. But what was it that Mark Andreessen, right, said software is eating the world, about a decade ago. And so since then, I think a lot of organizations have sort of been on a journey as it relates to delivering digital value with software. So I think most organizations begin with a technical value focus, meaning they understand there's a business value to be had, but they sort of get wrapped up in the technical details and sometimes kind of lose sight of the main plot or point. And it's technology for technology's sake. And then I think there's a wake-up call at some point for most organizations, and they realize, probably should be focused on the actual outcome, not just software or technical solution to solve a business problem, but actually what is the business outcome we're producing? What's the value? How can we measure it? How can we make sure we keep it in focus? Which is really, again, about numbers, return for the investment in that software. But in recent years, digital transformation has probably been about the consumer or customer, whether that's B2B or B2C, more than anything else. And in fact, I have this picture chosen specifically because customer experience is super, super important to your digital journey. And in fact, I've done whole presentations and whiteboards on this topic. But the value of customer experience is immense, and there's a ton that can be delivered, right, to both the business and the consumer or customer through a focus on experience. So software is at the heart of that as well. So I just put this as a reminder that this is kind of the journey organizations are going on, right? But the problem is it's not quite that simple, right? It's actually there's a customer need, a business need driven or solved by software that provides business value and ultimately customer value. But the problem is it just keeps accelerating, right? Our need to improve our speed of delivery, whether you call it agility, business agility, whatever you call it, the point is we have to do this faster and faster and faster. And this has really driven a significant change in recent years as to how software is developed and delivered. And I'm going to call it generically continuous software delivery, right? So there's a lot. There's CI/CD, there's DevOps, there's just Agile, if you will, the adoption of Agile in the enterprise. And all of these things really are about getting to a continuous software delivery. Oops, sorry about that. And in fact, recently in Forrester's Tech Tide of 2021, Q1, there's a quote which says continuous software delivery is critical to firms' ability to what? Win, serve, and retain customers. So it connects continuous software delivery to that top priority or goal around what? Customer value or customer experience. And this is key. We have to keep this in mind. And this holds promise to allowing us to sort of accelerate the delivery of software and thereby value to the customer, give us a competitive edge in the market and so forth, right? But here's the dilemma. Most organizations are making a choice, speed or quality, but not both. Why? Because traditional testing and quality practices are just too slow and they do not scale. If you notice in this sort of infinite loop of CI/CD or DevOps or continuous software delivery, right? Testing is still just a box. And most organizations, because quality and quality practices aren't their top priority, it gets relegated to a box, and it's basically they think about it as, oh, something we do after we do a build. After we do a build, which basically means probably UI-based testing, maybe some performance testing, probably significantly manual, in some cases automated, but it's hard because those become very brittle if you do a lot of builds. And so a lot of organizations are sort of stuck in the old days of testing, and yet they're trying to accelerate how they deliver quality, hence the dilemma, speed or quality, but they can't provide both. And this is unacceptable, right? So let's then talk about, well, actually, before we talk about, so this is maybe closer to the truth for most of us, which is, remember, quality is our top priority, but somebody on the board behind this guy, right, has crossed out quality with speed and said, no, it's not our top priority, speed is. And so quality is sacrificed, right? So let's talk about how we get out of that vicious cycle, and talk about how we can define, or how you can define a continuous testing strategy, right? So that you can deliver quality at speed. So again, that same report, the Forrester Tech Tide of Q1, gives us some interesting hints. So first of all, that Tech Tide is a continuous software delivery Tech Tide. It actually isn't. It's not a testing report. It's not a quality report. It's about continuous software delivery and all of the practices across the SDLC that are important to continuous software delivery. Here's the thing. Number one takeaway in this report this year, and I highly recommend you guys read this in detail, is testing tools must be a key area for investment to achieve continuous delivery, right? And it talks about the need to test earlier, more often, more rigorously, right? And to use tools and automation to help you get there. It talks about microservices and the increase in speed and the need to focus on testing APIs and automate testing wherever possible, right? These are all keys. So they give you categories, right? Forrester is giving us categories of testing technologies, or again, these are software delivery technologies, but in this case, turns out that half of the high business value categories of invest and maintain. So invest means it's high business value, but lower on the maturity scale, meaning most organizations are lower on the maturity, as well as the tools maybe are just starting to come to maturity. And maintain is basically these tools provide high business value, but are also high maturity, meaning there's lots of tools available. Some organizations are actually fairly mature in some of these areas on the right and the maintain. So these are the areas you have to pay attention to most closely. Where should we be investing? And if we haven't invested in one of those things in the maintain column, right, that should be a highest priority. And so here we see 6 distinct testing technologies. So first of all, API test automation, right? We live in a world where applications, or especially enterprise applications, they do not live on an island, right? They're very interconnected. APIs are very, very prevalent, and we use them, we consume them, and we provide them, right, to be consumed in our applications. And so API test automation is critical. It's not just critical for testing APIs, there's a security aspect to it as well. It's huge, right? Continuous functional test automation suites. So this is actually a whole wave, Forrester wave on this. And so I recommend you look at that wave to understand what those tools are, what they offer. But this is more of this idea of sort of end-to-end test capabilities, suites of tools versus best of breed approach. And again, in this report, Forrester actually recommends suites or platforms versus best of breed for a bunch of reasons to be successful. Another thing is we have these APIs, but what happens when we do not have an adequate test environment where we have to take advantage of 3 or 4 other applications that provide microservices to us, and we need to take advantage of those with the app we're developing, but we don't have access to an adequate test environment. We can't allow us to test that in production, and so we need to virtualize that environment, which is called service virtualization. So that's super critical. If you don't have that technology, you want to look at that. The next one is shift left performance test automation. So again, we've had this concept of shifting left. It's just now focus on the performance aspect of testing performance earlier in the life cycle. And then the ones in maintain I find interesting because I think unit testing is probably something most organizations do, but I'm not sure code quality scanning is something that happens, especially as you start thinking about security and compliance. It's super important. And again, these are all distinct areas of test automation that I think everybody should pay attention to. So interestingly enough, before I move off of this slide, the customer needs to be the center of continuous software delivery, right? There is the second key takeaway, okay? And there's a third actually as well. I left the title there because I thought it was relevant to the discussion thus far, which is, once again, we have to connect continuous software delivery with what customer experience or customer value. And so it's a super important aspect that's in the center of what we're actually measuring. And hence, it actually affects how we define quality as well, right? So with that, I don't want Gartner to feel left out. So I have my token, actually not, it's not token, but it's a really good, there's a report as well from Gartner about a solution path for testing software applications. And I think this is actually excellent because each of those orange boxes represents a whole set of research and a paper that they have produced that gives you insights into those areas. But they basically say, hey, look, there's 5 sort of steps or 5 areas in terms of a solution path. Number 1, we need to architect for testability. So this isn't, and notice it's not quality, although that would be important as well as part of that. But as we architect, we need to architect our software, right, such that it's easy, or it can be tested, right? So we need to be able to test, are we meeting the requirements, right? And so this is about requirements. It's about how maybe it's test-driven development or BDD, right, techniques. But the point is, there's ways very, very outset to ensure, right, that we can build a quality product that's easily verifiable, right? So we need to validate and verify, or verify and validate that software against the requirements. Okay, shift left is number 2. Also important, been around for a while, but I think people pay lip service to it, honestly. I think people, there's tools have come a long ways in allowing developers to do much more. But developers typically don't like testing, but it needs to be part of our culture, that developers are responsible for the quality of the code that they produce, and there's significant automation that can be used to help them. Number 3, we can't think of testing, again, as a very simplistic sort of monolithic thing. We need to test all of the layers of the application. I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail in a minute, right? Maintain environment parity, and then shift test right as well. So we want to shift left, shift right, but don't forget about the middle, so to speak. And so really this is a good recipe, and this research from Gartner is also extremely valuable. So if we take a look at that middle one, testing the layers of the app, Gartner recommendation specifically from the report says use and reuse tests through a layered strategy that leverages test automation at each tier of the application stack. But here's the key. Testing the entire stack through the GUI is less effective and will lead to issues being unexpectedly released in production. I'd say there's actually a lot more issues than that. So notice the very top of the pyramid is skinny, right? It says automated UI tests. And actually that white triangle at the very, very top would be manual testing. So some of you literally have put in your continuous delivery are stuck in manual testing mode. And all you're doing is spending time spinning your wheels at that little top triangle, right? The reason this triangle is this shape is because Gartner, and this isn't just Gartner, this has been adapted for years. Mountain Goat Software, I think maybe is one of the first to actually create this diagram, but basically saying, hey, look, we should be spending more time on code analysis earlier in the life cycle, reliability, security, right? And unit testing, and then API testing, and then automated UI testing, and then finally manual testing, right? This is commensurate of the amount of time we should be spending, the shape, the size of the shape. And yet most organizations flip this thing. It's completely upside down, right? The triangle's upside down, bouncing on a little tip. It becomes unbalanced and falls and breaks, kind of like Humpty Dumpty, right? Which is the whole point. Quality is brittle, and applications are brittle, really. And they call it quality is, quote, suspect, right? So this is a really, really good, kind of model to think through in terms of what are you doing in each of these different areas. And again, I think the Gartner report's great. The Forrester report I just mentioned also has a lot of good detail in there as well. So another way to kind of think about this is who's responsible, kind of a role-based approach. And if we think about a continuous quality suite or suite of tools that we need to put together, whether we put those together ourselves or we buy them from a single vendor that can provide all of these, right? We need to start with the developer, with code analysis, both regular code, static code analysis, but then SAST is specifically looking at the security aspects. Extremely important, right? Unit testing and code coverage. And then very closely related is if we're testing, we're doing V&V, what are we doing it against, right? There's a set of requirements driving, functional and otherwise, driving our testing. And that's where traceability comes in. So those things are super important from a development perspective. And the focus is here on innovation, minimizing testing burden. Make this automated, simple, easy, quick, integrated, automatic, right? It just should happen as part of your CI/CD pipeline. Most of this stuff, developers shouldn't have to leave their environment. They shouldn't have to work at this. It should be set up as part of your environment. So this stuff just sort of happens for the most part, right? You can use, there's tech tools out there that provide AI-based code coverage for unit testing. And they really help automate and generate a lot of the tests here. Static code analysis, man, you just run a tool against your code and it tells you, you know, pick the rules. Somebody configures it initially from an environment perspective and picking the rules you want to use and implement, whether it's MISRA or, you know, a whole host of other rules. And it just shows you the potential problems. And security being a big one, like OWASP, right? So the OWASP top 10, et cetera. So there's some really, really simple and good things you can do. This is where a lot of people think testing is about the QA, you know, about quality assurance or the tester themselves. I'd say, of course, we're not going to leave them out. And there's some sophistication necessary to, for instance, do a combination of UI, API testing, and service virtualization. And some tools actually combine those and allow you to sort of record sessions and generate both API scripts as well as UI scripts, maybe even using standards like Selenium and so forth, and then make it very, very simple and easy to virtualize the environment you need to ensure that you have a high quality test environment to actually test those API calls and so forth. And then, of course, load and performance testing as well, something that typically isn't, we're not just going to leave to the developer, but it's going to be more system level, right? So the reason all of these things fall maybe to QA tester is maybe they're more system level tests that occur in that box after the build, right? We do a commit, you know, to the main branch maybe, or to one of the main branches. There's a build process that happens, and then we definitely do have to do some testing at that point from a system perspective. So, and then finally, release management. So as we're getting ready to release, we want to assess the quality of the software we're producing, which is where reporting and analytics should come in, right? We should have dashboards. So management, those responsible for the release managers, et cetera, should be looking at a set of dashboards. These things should just be updated automatically through this whole process, right? And should all tie together. So this is why I think Forrester says best of breed maybe isn't the best approach in many instances, because when you take all of these different technologies from different vendors and you try to integrate them and automate them across your CI/CD pipeline, you might be spending more time, you know, architecting, tweaking, implementing, automating, and then reporting on, right? Then you are actually doing the testing, right? Doing the actual execution, which is where maybe you should be focused. So again, that's up to every organization to make those decisions. So so what's the result? The result is that CI/CD, you know, we call it a pipeline. I like this version because it's sort of continuous, needs to have a continuous testing band as part of the entire process. We need to have a focus on high focus on automation and the notion of continuous quality or continuous testing. And so I think this, you know, culture, this image, this definition is going to help you. And because you get immediate and ongoing feedback, right? Okay, so now let's turn to looking at how would you calculate, right, or project or calculate your return for your investment in testing. How do we calculate the value of what we're providing? Why, for you and your organization, right? So instead of, well, before we get into the details of the actual, I guess, calculations, let's just take another quick look, right, at kind of the motivation here, which is the cost of poor quality. So you can see it's huge. This breaks it down into that 2.08 trillion, right, into operational failures, which includes significantly cybersecurity failures and breaches. Unsuccessful development projects was actually the top growing category from the prior report That was, I think, in 2018. And then legacy systems as well is a big deal. And this does not, this 2.08 trillion doesn't include technical debt, which is anticipated, which is this is just new cost, if you will. Whereas technical debt is kind of the principal, if you will. There's no interest on that, no ongoing. It's there. And so we're talking about, a significant amount of cost here and technical debt. And in fact, you're seeing quality showing up in annual reports and investor conferences, like from companies like Walmart and United Healthcare and CVS, where this is just showing statements about technology and quality, and then as it relates back to customers in some instances, right, is super, super important. And they basically, it's becoming more prevalent to mention quality at that executive investor level. So before we, as we get into the calculations, I guess, not before, but as we get into them, right, we're actually going to be looking at data, right, or an example that comes from an actual customer. So Caesars Entertainment, right, stated that guest experience is their top priority above quality, but that's okay, because actually they fit together, because guess what? They also figured out early on, they were doing all these acquisitions, huge growth through acquisitions. I had no idea that Caesars Entertainment owned all of these brands. There's a lot of brands. If you go to Vegas as an example, just Vegas, but there's all over. They own a ton of cool brands in travel and entertainment, right? And so as you could imagine, right, multiple disconnected systems, right, across these companies that have been developed over many years, right, creates a whole set of challenges. For instance, if guest experience is number one, they had this goal of like a Disney-like experience, right? The need for a common and consistent guest experience across reservations, loyalty program, et cetera. So you could go from one hotel to another, from one casino to another, and do that seamlessly. And your points would carry over, and it would be really easy to basically have a single card where you could charge things from restaurants or gambling or other entertainment back to your room or your account ultimately, or rooms even, right back to your single account. You gain points for that. And they would be able to track, obviously, and give you rewards, and you would make it much easier, a better experience for yourself and your family. So they figured out pretty quickly, look, manual testing efforts are never going to keep pace with delivery. And in fact, they were plagued with quality issues and behind schedule. And this was several years ago. They realized that test automation was a key to efficient delivery of high quality guest experience or customer experience, right? And just as we've been saying, so this is in their words. And so this is really about their journey. And so what did they do? Well, this is not earth shattering. This formula has been around for a while. But I'll give you the real numbers behind what they actually saved, the cost avoidance over a period of years. But the equation, let's just go through the equation quickly, and then we'll look through an example. So the first thing is the manual time it would take if you were going to test manually. So how long would it take you to exercise the testing manually? So in this case, again, they down below have 31 hours to test manually, right? We're going to subtract the time because it still takes some time to execute the automation. So in this case, 1 hour. And so that's the time to execute the automation. And then we have times the hourly rate. In this case, we're just picking 50, which is a pretty low hourly rate. And so that is $1,500, right? So you take 31 minus 1, which is 30 hours times 50, is $1,500. So one simple execution of the tests, which could be done, maybe it's done weekly, maybe it's done daily. There's a cost avoidance when you automate it, right, of about $1,500. Now, if you then subtract off of that savings, how long did it take to create those tests, right? So if it took 5 hours to create the automation, then, at a run frequency of 1, you'd have a return of $1,250. Now, it turns out, because we're going to be executing these tests many times, that creation number is going to go down and down and down and down and become fairly insignificant. So if we take $1,500, the original $1,500 across 52 weeks, right? At $78,000 minus any delivery costs, which I guess you could include creation in that. You start seeing, hey, there starts becoming an ROI, right? So the real journey is, would you expect a huge ROI year one? Maybe not, but if we look at what did Caesar's experience, right? Year one wasn't huge, but it turned out that, again, this is per execution of their set of tests, how much they're saving, right? So year 6, they were saving, right, through self-service automation framework, CI, CT, continuous test, continuous delivery, right, completely integrated, over $1 million in savings by year 6. And then if you look at the total over those 6 years, right, it was over $2 million in cost avoidance. And it built over time. They stuck with it. They were committed. They continued to automate. They used a good framework. They had a good strategy around it. They looked at that pyramid and said, hey, we need to pay attention to this. This isn't just about, GUI testing, right? UI testing, which again is critical. We need to look at API testing, service virtualization, et cetera. And I think that's really, you'll find if you go to the case study, which I'm going to share with you, there's a huge aspect to this, which is really the behind the scenes, right? Integrating hundreds of different systems. How do you test that? How do you virtualize that? Big part, right? So the second calculation would be the reduced cost of defects. So and maybe that's a misnomer. It's we can reduce the cost of fixing defects. If we think about how we shift left, right? So the first one was really just about automation versus manual testing and the types of automation you would have to run to be successful. The second is we're going to, create software that's imperfect. There's going to be defects. The question is when do the defects get created and when we find them and remove them? And there's a big implication to this, right? And so most of you have probably seen this. This work has been around for a long time, right? Barry Beam has been reporting on this. I think is one of the original people that this can be attributed to this model. But basically, right, 85% of defects are created during coding. Big surprise in software, right? When we create the software, we code in defects. And then there's some, we introduce defects in other ways throughout, but again, a big high percentage, right? But the problem is we don't find them, right? Again, that box, that single box, think of a manual single box at the end after the build happens. And then what does it take to go back, kind of unravel that and figure out what's the defect, right? What's the problem with the code, right? There's a lot of steps. And so it turns out the percentage of defects found, right, is unfortunately, right, it grows as you go through, coding to unit testing all the way to performance and production. Production drops off some, which is good because those are super expensive to fix. So the problem with this is, right, the cost. So when we find a defect in performance testing, system testing, right, at that end, it's 40 times more expensive, right, than if we'd found it during coding. If coding is just 1x, then the amount of time, the amount of multiples of cost, right, is more significant. 640 times in production, which is bad news. And so what? Forrester, actually Gartner suggested that if we don't test early and often, what's going to happen? We're going to have defects, right? If we just do all our testing through the UI. There's going to be a lot of defects on in production. That's very expensive, right? So what do? We need to shift left, right? This is the whole point of finding and fixing defects. And so there is a major ROI to be had from this model as well. This is just one calculation. Again, at that cost of $50 an hour, here's a little table. And this actually, these are real numbers that came from a customer of ours, again, another customer who did a study, again, using some of these principles and models. But the reality is, these are some real numbers, right? And then depending upon defect severity, the cost on production, right, would vary from 100% up to a P1 of 130%. Those are actually more costly to fix because of the speed at which they had to do them and what the implications were, the cost of the organization, et cetera. So you can see that you save, each stage that you find a defect and fix it, right, or phase, right, you're saving money. But the reality is, if you think about production versus unit test, or in this case, it's just sit. If you can find a defect and sit instead of production, right, you're saving $9,150. That's a lot of money to be saving just by moving up when you find and fix defects. So again, I gave you a couple different ways of thinking about this, and really you need to combine those two, right? So it's not just, they're not mutually exclusive. They can be used together to define the value or return on software quality or continuous quality. And I gave you sort of a game plan to do it, and I gave you sort of the rationale why you need to do it, and probably, some things to think about on how you probably view quality today. So number one, establish your why for quality. This is important. There's a lot of money on the line, high cost of poor software quality, right? So then we need to define, well, what does quality really mean to your organization, right? Again, link it. You have to link it back to customer experience all the way. And then, there's technical value, business value, customer value, and your definition of quality has to include security, compliance, and those other things such as customer experience. And how are they going to experience your application, right? And quality is going to be key to that. Then we can establish a quality strategy and plan, right? Attack that pyramid, figure out how we automate, where we spend time. If we're not spending time at the bottom of the pyramid, right? How do we implement that as soon as possible? How do we make this automated? It just happens. Developers don't have to work for it. They don't like testing anyway. So how do we make it easier for them in their IDE? Consider maybe testing suites, et cetera, but establish your quality strategy and plan, which would include automation. And then finally, we need to project and measure your return. You need to do that while you're planning. It's a projection, and then you need to measure it as you go and see how it actually works for you. And this is where we can help you as well. Our organization does it. We have partners actually that can help you with this as well. So, I mean, this is the basic game plan that I would challenge each of you to think about. Now, let's go to the original cartoon. I'm going to actually unveil the rest of it. So here it is. Take a moment before we get to Q&A to read through this. I think it's pretty funny. All right. So with that, I'll give you a couple of resources you can use the QR code on as well. So that case study from Caesars is really informative. They actually presented at our automated testing and quality summit as well last year. You can actually listen to their presentation. There's a full case study as well. I recommend you check out the Parasoft automated testing and quality summit. There's a bunch of customers that speak. Caesars is just one of them. In fact, it was 95% customers speaking, or there was an analyst as well from Forrester, Diego, which I highly recommend listening to his session as well. But there you go. So you have the automated testing, software testing and quality summit on the left, and then Caesars being a case study, one of the featured speakers at that. Okay, so with that, let's get to Q&A.